All right, everybody, welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today we're going to be looking at something a little bit different, a little bit unexpected.
Yeah.
We're talking about the war in Ukraine and specifically some ideas about a possible timeline for peace.
Okay.
And this is all coming from one source that we're going to deep dive into today.
Sounds intriguing.
Some excerpts from an interview that Donald Trump gave to Sky News.
Okay, yeah, I saw some of that interview.
Yeah.
Pretty interesting stuff.
Definitely raised some eyebrows, and that's why we're here to take a closer look.
Right, yeah.
So let's just jump right into it. I guess the biggest thing that kind of jumped out at me reading through these excerpts was Trump's assertion that the war could end within weeks.
Yeah, I think that's what caught everybody's attention.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very different outlook than what we're hearing from most analysts and world leaders these days.
Yeah, it definitely stands in contrast to a lot of the prevailing narratives, I guess you could say.
For sure, for sure.
We hear a lot about kind of a long, protracted conflict, this war of attrition that's going on.
Right.
And, even the most optimistic predictions are usually talking about months or years, before any kind of resolution.
Absolutely.
So to hear, Trump talking about weeks is definitely eye-catching.
Very bold statement.
Hmm.
So I think before we go any further, maybe it'd be helpful just to give listeners a little bit of context, on the current state of the war, like what's actually happening on the ground and why is this week's prediction so out of the ordinary?
Well, as I mentioned, it is a very complex situation. It's a very fluid situation. Things are changing constantly.
Right.
But I think it is fair to say that right now we are in this kind of grinding war of attrition. Both sides have dug in. They're very entrenched.
Yeah.
Neither side has really been able to achieve kind of a decisive breakthrough. There's a lot of talk about potential spring offensives from both sides. But even if those are successful, it's not clear that that would necessarily lead to a quick end to the fighting.
Right.
I think there's a sense that even if there were major territorial gains, by one side or the other, it might just prolong the conflict.
It wouldn't be the end.
Rather than necessarily ending it, know. And then, on top of the military situation on the ground, you also have to consider the deep political and ideological divides that are at play here. This isn't just a territorial dispute. This is really a clash of visions for the future of Europe.
Right.
For the future of global security.
Yeah.
And bridging that gap is going to be extremely difficult no matter who's involved.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, taking all that into account.
Yeah.
This idea that it could all be wrapped up in a few weeks is...
Yeah, it does seem pretty far-fetched.
Pretty remarkable. And, and then you factor in who is making this prediction. We're talking about Donald Trump.
Right.
Who, has a history of making some pretty unconventional pronouncements.
He certainly does.
Especially when it comes to diplomacy.
Yeah.
His meetings with Kim Jong-un immediately come to mind.
Right. Yeah, and I think... it's fair to say that
Right.
Trump's approach to diplomacy has always been kind of to shake things up, to challenge the status quo. He likes to be disruptive. He likes to kind of, throw a wrench in the gears and see what happens.
Yeah.
And he seems to believe very strongly in the power of personal relationships,
Right.
Even with adversaries, even with people who, the rest of the world considers to be, enemies or whatever.
Yeah, for sure.
So, whether that translates into successful negotiation is a whole other question.
Another question.
But it's definitely his style.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's try to unpack some of the specifics here from this interview with Sky News.
Okay.
One thing that jumped out at me was he mentions a possible meeting with Zelenskyy this week or next week.
Okay.
Which again, very, very specific time frame.
Yeah, it's interesting that he put such a specific timeline on it.
Yeah.
It almost suggests that there's something already in the works, that there have been some back channel discussions or something like that.
And he knows something.
Yeah. But even if it is just him kind of trying to build momentum or generate some buzz.
Yeah.
It's still a very intriguing detail.
Yeah. And what do you make of that? I mean, if this meeting were to actually happen,
well,
how do you think that would play out?
It's hard to say. It really depends on so many factors. I think one of the big questions is how would Trump approach this meeting? Would he try to leverage his past relationship with Putin?
Right.
He's obviously spoken very highly of Putin in the past.
Yeah.
He's claimed to have a good relationship with him.
Yeah.
So would he try to use that to kind of, bring Putin to the table?
Yeah.
Or would he try to take a completely fresh approach,
Right.
And of course you have to consider Zelensky's perspective as well,
Right.
What are his objectives going into this meeting?
Right.
What kind of leverage does he have?
Yeah, what does he want to get out of it?
What are his red lines?
Yeah.
What's he willing to compromise on?
Yeah, for sure.
So there's just a lot of unknowns.
Yeah, and then adding another layer to all this.
Yeah.
Trump also mentioned sending European troops as peacekeepers.
Oh, right.
Yeah, that was another big one.
Is a pretty major, suggestion.
Yeah, that's a significant escalation.
Yeah.
Of Western involvement potentially.
Yeah, I mean that's a whole other
level of commitment.
And peacekeeping missions are very complex.
Right.
Right. They're complex to execute. They have a lot of historical baggage.
Yeah.
There's a lot of different models for peacekeeping.
Right.
It can range from just having, lightly armed observers.
Right.
Basically just monitoring the situation.
Right.
To having, very robust intervention forces,
right.
That are actually authorized to use force to, keep the peace.
Right.
And the effectiveness of peacekeeping varies widely,
right.
Depending on the context, depending on the, the specific situation on the ground.
Yeah.
And of course, one of the biggest challenges with any peacekeeping mission
right.
is getting buy-in from all the parties involved.
Yeah.
You need to have all sides agree.
You can't
to the terms of the mission. You can't just impose it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and I mean in this case.
Yeah.
You would need Russia's cooperation.
Absolutely. You would need Russia to agree
to
having foreign troops
pretty far-fetched
on their border.
Yeah.
Which is a big ask.
Yeah. So it's hard to know if this is just, kind of a strategic idea that Trump is throwing out there or if he's actually given serious thought to this.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to know what's going on in his head.
Yeah.
Right.
Is this part of some larger plan?
It could be just a way to kind of,
yeah.
Put pressure on Europe.
Right.
To get them more involved.
Yeah.
It could be a way to kind of, signal to Putin that, he's serious about finding a solution.
Right.
It's hard to say for sure.
And he was also asked in this interview about, the idea of Ukraine potentially ceding territory.
Okay.
As part of a peace deal. And he had a very cryptic response.
What did he say?
He just said, we'll see.
We'll see.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously that's...
Yeah, that's classic Trump, right? Very vague. Very...
Can't give anything away.
Non-committal.
Yeah.
But, I mean, it's a very loaded question, right?
It is.
Like, the idea of territorial concessions is always very sensitive.
It's always controversial, because...
Especially in a situation like this.
It's often seen as rewarding aggression.
Yeah.
It's like you're basically saying that it's okay to invade another country.
Right.
And take their land as long as you. Yeah,
as long as
you stop eventually.
They eventually stop, yeah. But, historically, territorial concessions have been a part of a lot of peace agreements.
Right. They're not unheard of.
Yeah. It's not unprecedented.
Right.
So it's definitely something that could be on the table.
Right.
But the question is, what would be acceptable to Ukraine?
Exactly.
What would be acceptable to Russia?
What would actually bring peace?
And what are the long-term consequences?
Right. And how would that impact...
Of any kind of territorial changes?
Stability in the region.
Would it just lead to more conflict down the road?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also interesting to consider this in the context of some of Trump's past statements.
Okay.
He's been critical of Europe in the past.
Yeah.
For not contributing enough aid to Ukraine.
He has.
And now he's suggesting that they send peacekeepers.
Right.
So do you see this as a contradiction, or is this just, a shift in his stance, or is there something else going on here?
It's hard to say. I mean, it's Trump, right?
It is Trump.
So, he's not always the most consistent
right.
In his views.
Yeah. And maybe he just sees this as a way to... Get Europe.
It's worth noting that, while the U.S. has definitely been the biggest provider of military and financial aid to Ukraine,
right?
A lot of European countries have stepped up as well. They've contributed billions of dollars in aid.
Right.
They've taken in millions of refugees.
Right.
So, it's not like they've been completely...
They're not doing nothing.
Hands off,
Right.
So I think Trump's view on this has always been kind of ambiguous. He's kind of waffled back and forth.
Right.
So this latest statement, could be a genuine call for greater European involvement. You know, it could be a way to kind of...
Or just a way to
pressure them into taking a more active role.
Yeah.
But it's definitely something to keep an eye on.
Yeah. So it seems like we have a lot to think about here.
We do.
We have Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Who, is known for his unconventional diplomacy.
Yeah.
Putting forth this very optimistic timeline for peace in Ukraine.
Right.
He's hinting at these high-level meetings.
Yeah.
Floating this idea of a major shift in European involvement.
Still a lot to unpack.
It's quite a lot to unpack, and it's, hard to know what to make of it.
Yeah. I mean, I think the big question is, is this just, Trump being Trump?
Right. Is this just...
Is he just trying to... grab headlines?
Is he trying to stay relevant?
Is he trying to, insert himself into the situation? Or is there something more to it?
Right.
Does he genuinely believe...
Does he actually have some sort of...
that he can broker a peace deal,
plan.
Within weeks?
Yeah.
And if so, what would that look like?
What would that peace deal look like?
What would the terms be?
Yeah.
What concessions would be made?
Yeah.
And what are the chances that it would actually hold?
Right. Yeah. What are the long-term implications?
So I think those are the questions we need to be asking ourselves.
Yeah. And I think those are the questions that, as we our listeners can think about.
Follow this story.
As they're, processing all this information.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we've given you a lot to chew on here today.
We have.
But we'd love to hear your thoughts.
Absolutely.
What do you make of all this? Do you think that Trump's pronouncements are, a glimmer of hope for a quick resolution?
Is this,
or is this just more
wishful thinking,
political posturing? Let us know your thoughts. Share your comments. We're all in this deep dive together.
That's right.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for having me.
We'll see you next time.
See you later.
Bye.